In the early days of heavy iron, tractors were rolling bombs. One wrong move on a hillside and 150 pounds of boiler pressure turned a steam engine into lethal shrapnel. But surviving explosive iron was just the start. How did one scrappy company endure those lethal fields, a brutal 440-day labor strike, and hostile takeovers by Texas oil money? The answer was engineered straight into the dirt. When heavy pulling sheared the teeth off early drivetrains, they didn't just beef up the gears, they turned the entire engine 90 degrees. By bypassing the weak link entirely, their machines held together while the competition chewed itself to pieces. From ruthless boardroom wars to the billion-dollar farm crash that forced them to swallow International Harvester whole, this is the brutal 180-year survival story of Case IH and the mechanical Frankenstein that saved them both. Wisconsin Territory, 1842. Jerome Increase Case is 23, flat broke, and operating strictly on credit after purchasing 6 primitive groundhog threshers using promissory notes. He possesses no factory and no crew. Case relies purely on a massive debt and a dead-on read that upper Midwest wheat production is about to explode. These rough pieces of kit trace back to a 1788 Scottish design. They could beat grain loose from the stalks, but that was their absolute limit. Leaving behind a pile of grain mixed with chaff forced farmers into the brutal task of manual winnowing. Every single bushel demanded hours of repetitive labor while breathing in choking dust. Looking at this bottleneck, Case recognized an engineering failure rather than a labor shortage. Tearing his 6th machine apart, he emerged in 1844 with a combined thresher separator. This new design ran the grain through a vibrating sieve while a spinning fan blasted heavy airflow across it. In a single pass, a lighter chaff blew out the back while heavy, clean grain dropped through. 3 hours of back-breaking hand labor per bushel plummeted to 10 minutes by the end of the century. He sold 5 of the machines to fund his travel west, kept that 6th one as a working prototype, and set up shop in Rochester, Wisconsin. The plan was to build a real factory, powered by a mill race off the Fox River Dam. Local water rights owners flatly refused him. By the next morning, Case hitched his prototype to a team of horses and hauled it east to Racine, right on Lake Michigan. Uncontrolled water power awaited him there. Driven purely by logistics, Racine offered the turning force required for heavy machine tools and direct access to Great Lakes shipping lanes. That mattered enormously when you're moving tons of cast iron across the frontier. From that spot, Case started building his single-pass threshers, and farmers lined up to buy them, because the alternative was eating dust and doing it by hand. By the time the Civil War hit in the 1860s, demand blew past what Case could handle alone. With men in uniform, farm labor dried up, and the pressure to mechanize reached a boiling point. Iron had to replace the men who weren't coming back. To handle the massive demand, Case brought in partners from 1863 to form J.I. Case & Company. 4 men running the whole operation. The industry called them the Big Four. Messina Erskine ran the shop floor, turning raw iron into working machines. Robert Baker pushed sales. Stephen Bull kept a tight grip on the ledger, making sure nobody spent cash they didn't have. Case himself drove the engineering. Friction appeared quickly, as a partnership only survives while everyone agrees. Case demanded his name cast into the iron of every machine to eliminate any ambiguity about the builder. His partners pushed back, sparking impolite boardroom fights. These power struggles ran parallel to massive engineering problems out in the dirt. Out in the fields, the early steam traction engines were actively trying to kill people. Before these machines became rolling bombs, Case built an 8-horsepower portable steam engine known as Old Number 1 in 1869. It powered the thresher, but required heavy draft horses to drag it from field to field because the engine lacked gearing to its own wheels. Even when Case finally geared the engine to the wheels so the machine could move on its own weight, the steering was still dead primitive. Operators literally hitched horses to the front axle of a running steam engine just to point the wheels. Far from quiet, a steam traction engine was a portable boiler on steel wheels. It burned coal or wood to boil water and drive a massive piston that turned the rear wheels through a heavy chain of cast gear. And out on the treeless northern plains, finding wood or coal was a logistical nightmare. Case engineered specialized draft boilers, allowing firemen to shovel leftover wheat straw straight into the firebox and feed the harvest right back into the machine. Heavy-duty Case engines eventually cranked out 150 psi of operating pressure. Even the early straw burners pushing 100 psi could turn a boiler into a bomb without careful operation. A good crew could manage the risk on flat ground, put that machine on a hillside, and gravity sent the boiler water sloshing toward the low side. This movement exposed the crown sheet, the steel roof directly over the firebox, to direct flame without water to absorb the heat. Glowing red iron softened under that 150 psi, warped, and tore open. Escaping steam instantly expanded, turning the entire boiler into heavy iron shrapnel blasting in every direction. These boilers did have a failsafe, a soft tin core fusible plug tapped into the crown sheet, meant to melt and dump steam onto the fire if the water dropped too low. Stubborn engineers frequently swapped these plugs for solid iron bolts to prevent stopping the harvest. They traded their only safety net for a few more hours of runtime. Running these rigs demanded a full crew. An engineer manned the controls while a fireman shoveled coal, and young water monkeys hauled water from the nearest creek. Bucket by bucket, they dragged hundreds of gallons across rough ground to keep the boiler fed. Engineers found out the hard way if the water supply fell behind. One long blast and 3 short blasts on the steam whistle signaled impending disaster. Critically low water and a hot crown sheet meant an explosion was imminent unless water hit the tank immediately. Case stamped his name on an eagle for a reason. Jerome Case encountered Old Abe in 1861, a bald eagle serving as the live mascot for Company C of the 8th Wisconsin Infantry. Screaming over artillery during brutal Civil War combat, the bird became a regional symbol of toughness. Case adopted Old Abe as the company logo and cast that eagle onto his machines. He understood that a brand is a reputation, and reputation is the only thing that survives a bad harvest. By 1894, the iron castings showed the bird perched on top of a globe. Case wasn't subtle about how far he planned to reach. Cyrus McCormick ran a massive Chicago operation threatening to eat the entire market, while Case fought boardroom battles and his crews hauled water up muddy hills. McCormick's factory pumped out reapers at serious scale, backed by massive capital, brand recognition, and a sprawling distribution network. Case remained a scrappy outfit, battling partners and trying to keep boilers from blowing operators to pieces. The Great Chicago Fire erupted on October 8, 1871, burning for 2 days. McCormick's factory vanished, alongside a massive section of the city. Decades of production lines, 2,000 completed machines, and proprietary wooden patterns turned to white ash and twisting iron. Up in Racine, Case's plant was untouched. Case moved fast. He offered to build McCormick's machines, extending a seemingly generous hand to a rival. This calculated play to view McCormick's blueprints failed, when McCormick flat out refused the hustle. By the time McCormick rebuilt his factory, Case had taken market ground that wasn't going to be given back. The original partnership finally broke apart in 1880. Case reincorporated as the J.I. Case Threshing Machine Company. He finally had the clean naming control he'd fought for since the 60s. No more shared authority, no more boardroom fights over the nameplate. The iron said Case, full stop. By the late 1880s, Case steam traction engines were tearing through wheat harvests across the northern plains at a scale unthinkable 40 years prior. Operators measured these rigs by the power split, not just raw pulling force. A rig putting out a sluggish 15 horsepower at the drawbar could simultaneously deliver 30 horsepower at the belt pulley to keep the thresher chewing. Massive rigs pulling 12 bottom plows, turning over miles of dark earth. Giant, portable threshers parked at the edge of fields, running for days straight, fed by crews working in shifts through the soot and chaff. To actually run the thresher, you had to line the steam tractor up perfectly and string a heavy 100-foot canvas or leather drive belt through the flywheels. If that belt snapped under a heavy load, it whipped through the air with enough kinetic energy to take a man's arm clean off. The water monkeys were still running their buckets, the firemen were still watching their pressure gauges, and the engineers were still nursing massive boilers up grades that had no business holding heavy iron. But the physics of steam power had a hard ceiling, and the men running those crews felt it every day. Real pulling force required a massive boiler. That meant 15,000 to 20,000 pounds of boiling water and cast iron sitting on rigid steel wheels. 10 tons of dead weight on soft Midwestern mud left these rigs constantly fighting to avoid sinking to their axles. Internal combustion captured the attention of a new generation of engineers. Burning fuel directly inside a cylinder bypassed the heavy boiler entirely. Eliminating the boiler meant ditching the water monkeys, firemen, iron shrapnel risks, and the dead weight of hauling water. Case built his name, his factory, and his entire identity on the hiss and roar of steam. What was coming next would force them to tear that identity apart and start over. By 1911, internal combustion was shoving steam out the door. No crown sheets failing under 150 psi of boiler pressure, no water monkeys hauling buckets up hillsides, just fuel, air, compression, and spark. Real pulling power without dragging a rolling bomb across your fields. Case engineers in Racine knew steam was dead, but the transition was ugly. Gasoline engine torque destroyed early 1900s gear technology. The standard 90-degree bevel gear driving the rear axle shattered constantly under the load. Heavy pulls on the drawbar sheared the teeth clean off, stranding operators in the dirt with blown drivetrains and looming harvest deadlines. Mounting the engine sideways sounds simple, but casting that fix into production iron required serious nerve. Case turned the engine 90 degrees, running the crankshaft parallel to the rear axle. Straight-cut spur gears and a heavy chain and sprocket drove the wheels. Zero axial loading. Direct power transfer. No 90-degree turn to shear teeth. Sure, that exposed roller chain ate dirt and needed constant greasing, but torque traveled straight from the crank to the dirt, bypassing the weak link entirely. That's the cross motor. Case rolled them out around 1915. Farmers named them for the transverse engine sitting crossways in the frame. It looked odd, but operators knew it would pull as long as the cast iron old Abe Eagle sat bolted to the front. Out in the field, dragging a multi-bottom plow through heavy clay, that drivetrain held together while the competition's bevel gears chewed themselves to pieces. Case scaled the cross motor through the 1920s, churning out legendary iron like the nimble 1018 and the massive 2240, packing enough pound-feet of torque for serious acreage. The 1920s and 30s kept Racine running, but times were lean. The Depression gutted farm income. Operators who could afford new iron bought the cheapest thing that could pull. Case held on, refining their models. By the late 1930s, gear metallurgy caught up. Bevel gears stopped grenading, so Case moved back to conventional inline engines and sprayed them with that iconic flambeau red. But the reputation for building bulletproof drivetrains was already baked into the brand. Then came December 1941. The consumer market vanished overnight. The government needed heavy machine tool capacity, and Racine had it. The line retooled fast. Case machinists built wing assemblies for the B-26 Marauder, a notoriously hot-landing bomber the crews called the Widowmaker, and over 1,400 mobile carriages for the 40mm Bofors. Tight tolerances were mandatory. Downrange, a busted part meant dead men. Tractor production slowed to a crawl, while Case shipped military hardware to Europe and the Pacific, instead of tractors to Kansas and Nebraska. Post-war, Case had intact factories and a hardened workforce. They were primed for the biggest farm equipment boom in decades. Farms across the country were limping along on worn-out pre-war iron, desperate for new machines. This should have triggered an absolute gold rush. Instead, deep-rooted conflict sparked a brutal 440-day strike in 1945. The Supreme Court dropped the hammer in 1944 with J.I. Case Company v. NLRB. The ruling struck down President Leon Clausen's tactic of using individual contracts to block union organizing. The ruling just made Clausen, a stubborn former John Deere executive, dig in deeper. When wartime labor agreements expired, the United Auto Workers demanded better wages, and Clausen flat out refused. The day after Christmas, 1945, the factory gates slammed shut. Workers hit the picket line and stayed there 440 days. A total shutdown of primary production exactly when competitors were running flat out. Case sat silent through 1946, while International Harvester and John Deere devoured the largest agricultural boom in U.S. history. Every frozen day, Deere sold tractors. Every week, IH poached dealers. Case's old blockman system, hard-nosed regional reps enforcing dealer exclusivity, watched the network collapse. Dealers cannot eat loyalty. Without iron to sell, they signed with Deere or IH just to survive. Getting them back would be a nightmare. Case eventually settled, and production restarted, but you don't get a do-over on an historic buying surge. Guys who bought John Deere or IH weren't switching back just because the gates opened. What kept Case alive wasn't luck. It was the legacy of the crossmotor, machines that refused to quit. Old-school dealers knew what a Case drivetrain felt like under a heavy load. That raw credibility gave Case a foundation to rebuild on. But the post-strike farm market had a ceiling. Meanwhile, American cities were exploding. Vets came home, bought houses, and contractors had to clear raw dirt, stumps, and broken ground to build them. Road crews moved millions of tons of earth. Utilities dug endless trenches. The construction boom pulled capital and labor like never before. Those job sites needed heavy iron that a farm tractor could never replace. Tractors are built to pull implements through the dirt. Digging foundations or loading fill trucks on tight city lots required a fundamentally different tool. Contractors needed machines that could push dirt from the front and dig from the rear all day without cracking the frame. Guys were finding this out the hard way, snapping farm tractors in half trying to force them to do construction work. The urban boom wasn't waiting for the agriculture industry to catch up, and Case couldn't afford to stand still, which pushed them straight toward building the holy grail of dirt work, the factory-integrated loader backhoe. The construction boom gave Case a massive market to chase. First, they had to solve a mechanical problem that was snapping machines in half across job sites from coast to coast. Traditional tractor design relied on a cast iron transmission housing as the structural spine instead of a steel frame. That cast iron has a carbon content pushing 2.0 to 4.0%. Great compressive strength, sure, but absolutely zero ductility. Cast iron doesn't bend under stress, it shatters. Bolt the loader bucket to the front and a heavy backhoe to the rear. Now the loader pushes back into the dirt while the backhoe boom swings out, driving twisting leverage into the rear. That brittle cast iron spine tries to absorb both forces at once, and it can't. The housing cracks, welds pop like gunshots, and the machine folds in the dirt. Case watched contractors brutalize farm iron on job sites, losing sleep over the cash sitting right in front of them. In 1957, after buying American Tractor Corporation and absorbing their engineers, Case dropped the Model 320. Not a farm tractor with bolted-on attachments, a purpose-built machine. It featured a continuous rolled steel frame running the full length of the chassis, engineered from the dirt up to run a front loader and a rear backhoe simultaneously without tearing itself apart. Under the hood, the original 320 ran a 148 cubic inch Case gas engine, pushing out 42 horsepower. It wasn't breaking land speed records, but paired with that heavy steel frame, it had the low-end grunt to rip through hardpan. That rolled steel frame separated the 320 from everything else in 1957. Steel flexes. It absorbs kinetic shock waves that shatter cast iron outright. By running that frame as one solid piece, Case bypassed the brittle engine block and transmission housings entirely. Elton Long stands directly behind that bulletproof frame design. Case tapped this engineering bulldog to run the dirt division, where he perfected rear-end geometry capable of digging all day without snapping. The pushing force from the loader and the digging torque from the backhoe fed straight into that rigid steel structure. No metal joints to fatigue, no cast iron spine to snap. All that structural steel is dead weight without fluid power. Case ran a heavy-duty hydraulic pump pushing roughly 1,500 psi, giving that backhoe enough breakout force to chew through frozen clay without stalling the engine. When Case bought out ATC, they weren't just buying engineers, they were buying the guys who built the TerraTrack crawler, which handed Case the clutchless Terramatic transmission. They didn't put the Terramatic in the 320, it ran a high-speed mechanical shuttle instead, but it still had operators baying through forward and reverse gears fast enough to drastically cut cycle times. When you're loading a truck and backing up 50 miles an hour, that isn't a luxury. That's cycle time, and cycle time is money. Out on the job, that integrated frame meant the 320 could safely lift 3,000 pounds in the front bucket and dig a trench over 12 feet deep in the back. For a wheeled rig in 1957, those numbers were completely unheard of. That made the 320 the world's first factory-integrated tractor loader backhoe, not field-modified, not hacked together by a dealer, factory-built from the frame up. Case stamped their name on it and walked straight into a market starving for heavy iron. The dealer war that followed was brutal. Case pushed hard for exclusive regional lockups before Deere, Caterpillar, and the British outfit JCB could establish footholds. The strategy? Get your iron in the dirt first. Sign dealers to exclusive terms and choke out competitors. Case wasn't asking nicely. They drew hard lines on the map. Deere fought back because Deere always does. Cat flexed its massive dealer network, pushing in from their crawler and grading side. JCB pushed their own backhoe design into the U.S. with solid engineering. British engineers love to claim JCB invented the backhoe in 1953, while Americans point back to the Wayne Roy Corporation's first hydraulic rig in 1947. Either way, competitors were still just bolting hose onto farm tractors. None of Case's competitors had a single factory-integrated TLB in 1957. Case had the head start. The 320 was moving dirt while competitors scrambled to catch up. Even with the financial mess, Case's construction sales kept climbing through the 60s. The 320 spawned models with more horsepower and heavier hydraulics, and they didn't just crank up the horsepower, they finally upgraded the operator station, ditching the rigid steel pan seats so a guy could run the levers for 10 hours without wrecking his spine. Every generation banked on the 320's reputation for refusing to crack when other machines failed. That reputation bought market share, and that market share created a balance sheet that started catching the eye of outsiders. Men who understood money, but didn't know a damn thing about the dirt. Tenneco was a Houston oil and gas conglomerate with pipelines across the Gulf Coast and zero history in heavy equipment. What they had was cash. In 1967, Occidental Petroleum's Arm & Hammer launched a hostile takeover targeting the Kern County Land Company. Tenneco bought Kern County strictly to block the move, absorbing KCL's 53% controlling stake in Case as a massive collateral asset. This wasn't a calculated industry play. It was collateral damage from a Texas oil patch power struggle. The Racine engineers didn't disappear overnight. They kept building heavy iron. Contractors kept buying Case because they knew the machines wouldn't fold. But now, the big decisions ran through a Houston boardroom, full of suits whose instincts were entirely financial, not mechanical. Tenneco's cash fueled Case's expansion into the 1970s, buying up companies and muscling into new markets. Tenneco's oil money let Case go on an absolute buying spree, snapping up outfits like Drott Manufacturing in '68. That single move handed Case the cruise airline and put them dead center in the heavy excavator game. On paper, it looked like unstoppable growth, but Case's foundation was still tied to the farm economy. Out of the Midwestern dirt, a financial storm was brewing that nobody sitting in a Houston high-rise could see coming. That storm hit the Farm Belt like a brick wall. Land values borrowed against through the 70s collapsed overnight. Interest rates spiked past 20%, and the export markets soaking up American grain vanished. Farmers who stretched to buy heavy iron in the boom years couldn't service their debt, let alone buy new machines. Dealerships choked. Orders flatlined. The farm equipment market didn't just slow down, it drove off a cliff. International Harvester took the most brutal beating. Hemorrhaging cash long before the crash, IH suffered a 6-month strike across 79 and 80 that cost roughly $400 million in lost iron. By the early 80s, their shrinking revenue couldn't cover the crushing debt. They burned through capital at a rate that panicked the banks, shuttering plants and auctioning off divisions just to keep the lights on. The agriculture side of IH, the famous red tractors that dragged plows across the Corn Belt for generations, couldn't stand on its own. Tenneco saw blood in the water. In 1985, they forced a shotgun merger between Case and IH's agriculture division, stitching two wounded companies together into Case IH. That deal meant padlocking the Farm Wall Works in Rock Island, Illinois, the crown jewel of a company that had stamped out over 5 million tractors. The Farmall name went dark. On paper, Tenneco held a royal flush. On the ground, the merger sparked a boardroom war that poisoned the well. Two sets of legacy executives dug in. Factories weren't closed because the math demanded it, but because corporate politics made it easier to lock the gates than decide whose crew would run the floor. Superior IH tractor designs, like the fully developed, highly anticipated Super 70 series, died on the drafting table simply because the wrong faction owned the blueprints. Tenneco CEO James Kettleson had zero patience. Whether Kettleson actually flew a helicopter into the Racine tarmac to fire the president on the spot is one of those great pieces of corporate mythology that's hard to prove. The pressure was very real. Case IH President Jerome Green was pushed out in 1987 when those massive losses and production delays finally boiled over, creating a pressure cooker for the engineering teams. You're looking at a merged company with a toxic boardroom, shuttered plants, and a farm market still bleeding out. That's a lot of weight on a cracked frame. But the floor engineers found something in the scrap pile worth saving. Dr. Glenn Colley saved the IH Burr Ridge Engineering Lab by walking Kettleson through sub-zero test chambers capable of flash freezing a tractor block to minus 40 Fahrenheit. It proved whether a cold start system actually cranked or just looked good on paper. Kettleson spared the facility, and Burr Ridge is exactly where the Magnum's drivetrain was born. The engineers built a mechanical Frankenstein, and they knew it. They combined the best of both worlds. Power came from Case's relentless 8.3-liter turbocharged Cummins diesel. Born from the CDC, a gritty 50-50 joint venture between Case and Cummins, this block served as an absolute torque monster. IH supplied the 18-speed full power shift transmission. Farmers who had already run the partially power-shifted IH50 series flat out refused to go backward to a clunky manual, which meant the engineers had to make it work by mating that smooth IH shifting to the raw pulling power of the Cummins. The power shift let an operator bang through gears under heavy load without touching a clutch pedal. Hydraulically actuated clutch packs inside the gearbox took the abuse. You didn't break traction, you didn't stall on a grade, you pushed the lever, the box grabbed the next gear, and the Cummins kept roaring. Crucially, they scrapped 1980s electronics. The shift control ran through a strictly mechanical rotary valve designed by Ben McCash. No black boxes to short out in a muddy trench, no sensors freezing at minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, just machine steel doing its job. Neither company had the pieces to build that drivetrain alone. Together, it was bulletproof. On top of that bulletproof drivetrain, they dropped on a brand new cab designed with actual input from Porsche engineering. It gave operators a quiet, sealed workspace that blew the old rattling tin boxes out of the water. That mechanical Frankenstein rolled off the line as the legendary 7100 series, and models like the flagship 7140 quickly proved they could put nearly 200 horses to the drawbar and drag heavy iron through wet clay all day without sweating. Launched in 1987, the Magnum hit the dirt just as surviving farmers desperately needed reliable heavy iron to work massive acreage. The drivetrain delivered. Dealers finally had a machine they could put in front of a hardened buyer and stand behind. It didn't fix the rot overnight. Plant closures permanently destroyed production capacity. By the early 90s, Tenneco had spent 2 decades proving they had no business building heavy machinery. Wall Street Capital doesn't teach you why a hydraulic circuit needs matched steel components. A frame either holds the stress or it snaps. A hydraulic loop hits its pressure or it blows a seal. Quarterly reports can't alter physics. But the Case IH brand had stabilized. The Magnum was moving on. The company wasn't a total wreck anymore, which meant it was ripe to sell, and the next buyer wasn't another American conglomerate chasing oil money. Fiat signed the papers in 1999. Just like that, a 157-year-old Wisconsin company with steam traction roots and a bald eagle on the hood belonged to an Italian industrial group. They folded Case and New Holland together into CNH Global. For guys who'd spent decades turning wrenches on Case iron, it felt like the brand got handed off to suits who'd never stood in a muddy trench waiting for a backhoe to finish a cut. Back in the Tenneco days, guys knew the heartbeat of a rig like the iconic 580K was a bulletproof 3.9-liter Cummins block. But Fiat brought something Tenneco didn't, a genuine appetite for building machines, not just owning them. CNH pushed Case deeper into construction through the 2000s, but the real squeeze came when the EPA started tightening emissions. Diesels that ran clean in 1985 were choking on red tape by 2010. The engineering cost of bolting on DPF systems and SCR to meet Tier 4 regulations was brutal. Every manufacturer fought the same bloody war: keep the torque up and bolt on enough exhaust scrubbers to keep the feds happy, without turning the rig into a money pit of parked regen cycles, hissing valves, and cooked sensors. Case bled through Tier 4 like the rest of them, but the next shift came from a blind spot. By the late 2010s, batteries finally got dense enough to run actual construction iron through a real work cycle. Not a golf cart, not a warehouse forklift humming on flat concrete. Heavy iron digging and loading in the dirt. Case called their answer Project Zeus, the 580 EV electric backhoe. It uses the same continuous frame layout that legendary engineer Elton Long and his team poured decades into refining. That exact continuous frame layout didn't just work, it dominated the dirt. A 480-volt, 90-kilowatt-hour lithium-ion pack replaces the rattling diesel block, driving 2 separate electric motors. Case engineered a massive breakthrough by completely decoupling the drivetrain from the hydraulics. One motor handles the transmission, while a dedicated implement motor drives the hydraulic pump. When operators heard about it, they all asked the same thing: does it hit? Backhoes live and die on breakout force. Diesels require spooled RPMs to hit peak power, whereas electric motors deliver peak torque from a dead stop. When you curl that bucket into hard clay, that implement motor drives the hydraulics to instantly dump 14,452 pounds of bucket breakout force. No spooling, no screaming exhaust, no forced regens in the middle of a pour. The power is already there. That doesn't mean the 580 EV is a silver bullet. Runtime is a hard limit on a full production site, and bitter cold saps battery capacity just like it kills diesel efficiency. Nobody is pretending a battery backhoe will replace diesel at every job tomorrow, but Project Zeus proved electric iron can do the heavy lifting right now on the right job. While the EV program ran, Case tackled a totally different headache: compact equipment. Urban job sites were shrinking. Contractors in dense downtowns or narrow utility trenches needed a rig small enough to fit, but tough enough to push serious dirt. Compact track loaders filled the gap, exposing the ugly physics of using a loader like a dozer. CTLs are built to lift. Bolting a dozer blade to the front and pushing against a rock shelf routes brutal force backward through the loader arms. They flex. Pivot points grind. Pins snap. You quickly find the weak link in that load bath. Case built a Minotaur DL550 from the dirt up to fix it. This is a true compact dozer, not a CTL wearing dozer clothes. The secret is the C-frame. It's a massive structural wrap tying the blade directly into the undercarriage. It routes every pound of dozer load straight into the track frames, totally bypassing the lift arms. The stress goes where the heavy iron is. And with a 114 horsepower block laying down over 25,000 pounds of drawbar pull to the dirt, contractors push heavy material all day without the machine tearing itself apart. The job site doesn't care about last year's paperwork. It only cares about what's in front of the blade today. That exact lesson spans 180 years. Jerome Case hauled a prototype thresher on borrowed credit, and today, electric backhoes dig in zero-emission zones. The iron doesn't lie, and it doesn't wait. You either build the right machine for the job, or the dirt wins. Case learned that lesson through boiler shrapnel, a 440-day picket line, Texas oil money, and the Tenneco boardroom merger that forced them to swallow International Harvester whole. Corporate strategy didn't save them. Engineers who understood load paths gave us the overcenter boom, shifting that heavy rear iron forward so the front axle actually hugged the road. Add the legendary 3.9-liter Cummins under the hood, and you had a rig that could rip through frost without breaking a sweat. That's why Case moved nearly 750,000 backhoes by its 50th anniversary in 2007. Irony strikes hard. A brand built on 19th century steam and heavy iron now digs foundations for AI data centers. In those tight urban zero-emission zones, the 580 EV's silent 14,452 pounds of breakout force isn't a marketing pitch. It's a legal requirement just to get on the job. Turned a wrench on an old 580? Or maybe you pulled across with a Magnum, the first true heavyweight born from the Case IH merger? Drop a comment below and hit subscribe before you clock out.